Sometimes the front door you unlock at the end of a long day is not the one waiting to change your life. Sometimes it is the one waiting to change your heart. Rain drifted quietly across the empty streets as Nathan Brooks guided his black luxury sedan through the winding roads leading toward the hillside, where his estate overlooked the sleeping city below. It was nearly 11:30 at night, and every light inside the neighboring homes had already faded into darkness. The windshield wipers moved in a slow rhythm while soft jazz played through the speakers, filling the silence that had accompanied Nathan home almost every evening for the past 7 years. His day had been another victory by every standard the business world admired. A successful merger, record profits, handshakes, congratulations, magazine interviews. Yet as the iron gates opened and the long stone driveway welcomed him home, the familiar feeling returned. There was no excitement waiting beyond the front door, no laughter drifting from another room, no voice calling his name. The magnificent mansion stood exactly as he had left it that morning, flawless, elegant, and painfully quiet. Nathan parked beneath the covered entrance and stepped into the cool night air, adjusting the collar of his charcoal overcoat against the light rain. The porch lights illuminated polished stone steps leading toward towering oak doors that had become little more than the entrance to another silent evening. Then he stopped. At first he thought someone had left behind a forgotten suitcase. A small shape rested near the doorway, barely moving beneath a faded gray blanket. He narrowed his eyes, taking one cautious step forward. The shape stirred slightly. It was not luggage. It was a little girl sleeping peacefully against the front door as though she had finally found somewhere safe enough to close her eyes. She could not have been older than 6. Blonde hair escaped from beneath the hood of an oversized sweater, and tiny white sneakers, worn but carefully cleaned, peeked from under the blanket. Beside her rested a small blue backpack that looked almost too light to contain everything a child owned. One small hand clutched an old brass key so tightly that her fingers had turned pale around it, while the other rested protectively over a folded piece of paper placed neatly beside the backpack. Nathan's heartbeat slowed. The security cameras should have alerted someone. The gate should never have allowed anyone onto the property unnoticed. None of it made sense. He quietly knelt a few feet away, unwilling to wake her too suddenly. The rain had left tiny droplets across the blanket, but somehow the little girl continued sleeping with the peaceful exhaustion of someone who had simply run out of strength. Nathan carefully reached toward the folded paper instead of disturbing her. Written across the front in careful handwriting were only 7 words. "Please do not make her leave again." He read the sentence once. Then again. There was no signature, no explanation, no address, only those words. They settled into the silence around him far more heavily than he expected. Nathan looked back at the child. Even in sleep, she held the old key as though letting go might mean losing the last piece of something precious. The cold night air seemed sharper now, and the enormous mansion behind him suddenly felt less impressive than it ever had before. For years, he had unlocked those front doors believing they protected everything he had built. Tonight, standing beneath the porch light with rain falling softly around them, he wondered if they had actually been waiting for someone who had nowhere else to go. Just then, the little girl stirred, slowly opened her tired blue eyes, and looked directly at the stranger standing before her. She did not ask where she was. She did not ask who he was. In a voice barely louder than the falling rain, she whispered, "Did I finally find the right house?" Nathan did not answer immediately. He simply looked into the little girl's tired blue eyes, searching for fear, confusion, or panic. Instead, he found only quiet hope, the kind that seemed far too heavy for someone so young to carry alone. Rain continued falling softly around them until he finally removed his overcoat and gently draped it across her shoulders. "You found a safe place for tonight," he said in a calm voice. "Come inside before you catch a cold." The little girl nodded without hesitation, carefully slipping the folded note into the front pocket of her small blue backpack before standing. She never released the old brass key clutched in her tiny hand. Nathan unlocked the massive oak doors, and warm light spilled across the front steps, revealing a home that seemed almost too large for one person. The marble foyer echoed with every footstep as they entered. A sweeping staircase curved toward the second floor, while tall windows overlooked the rain-soaked gardens outside. Expensive paintings decorated the walls, and elegant furniture filled every room with perfect order. Yet despite its beauty, the mansion felt strangely empty. The little girl paused near the entrance, quietly looking around without the excitement most children might have shown. Instead of asking about the grand piano or sparkling chandelier, she slowly removed her damp shoes and placed them neatly beside the door. Nathan noticed the thoughtful gesture immediately. "You do not have to do that," he said gently. She looked up at him with a shy smile. "I do not want to make your house dirty." Those simple words settled into the silence between them. Nathan had welcomed business executives, politicians, and celebrities into this home over the years. None of them had ever worried about leaving footprints behind. He led her toward the spacious kitchen where soft lights reflected across polished stone countertops. Opening the refrigerator, he found fresh soup prepared earlier by the housekeeper before she left for the evening. Within minutes, warm vegetable soup and slices of homemade bread rested on the dining table. The little girl climbed carefully into one of the oversized chairs but did not immediately touch the food. Instead, she folded her hands politely in her lap and waited. Nathan looked at her with quiet curiosity. "You can eat," he said with a reassuring smile. "It is all for you." She looked down at the bowl before softly asking, "Can I save some for tomorrow if I do not finish?" Nathan felt something tighten inside his chest. There was no greed in her question, no fear of being told no, only the quiet habit of someone who had learned not to expect another meal too soon. He gently slid the bowl a little closer. "Tomorrow will have its own dinner," he replied. "Tonight you do not have to save anything." She smiled for the first time since waking on the front steps. It was a small smile, almost hesitant, but it transformed her face completely. As she slowly ate, Nathan sat across the table with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. He watched her glance toward every doorway before taking another spoonful, as though she expected someone to tell her she no longer belonged there. When she finally relaxed, her shoulders softened, and the room seemed warmer than it had felt in years. After several quiet minutes, Nathan asked the question that had been waiting in his mind ever since he found her outside. "What is your name?" The little girl carefully set down her spoon before answering. "Emily Parker." Nathan nodded. "I am Nathan." Emily smiled politely. "I know. Your mailbox says Mr. Nathan Brooks." He almost laughed. "Then I should ask something else." Emily tilted her head. Nathan looked at the old brass key still resting in her hand. "Can you tell me why you came to my house?" Emily lowered her eyes to the key and gently wrapped both hands around it. After a long, thoughtful silence, she whispered, "Because my mom told me that if I ever lost my home, I should keep looking until someone opened a door instead of asking me to leave." Nathan did not ask another question that night. Some answers deserved rest before they deserved words. After Emily finished the last spoonful of soup, she quietly carried the empty bowl toward the sink without being asked. The bowl looked almost too large in her small hands, yet she moved with practiced care, as though she had learned long ago that leaving things tidy made people less likely to become upset. Nathan gently took the bowl from her before she could reach the counter. "Thank you," he said. "You are the guest tonight." Emily looked genuinely confused by the sentence. "Guests usually get to come back," she answered softly. Nathan paused for a moment before replying. "Then tonight, you are still my guest." He led her upstairs to one of the many bedrooms that had remained untouched for years. The room overlooked the eastern gardens where rows of maple trees swayed gently beneath the rain. Fresh white blankets covered the bed, and a small reading chair rested beside the window beneath a warm lamp. Emily stepped inside slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. She carefully placed her blue backpack on the floor beside the bed, but the old brass key never left her hand. Nathan noticed it again. "You really do not let go of that key, do you?" Emily shook her head. "Mom said I should always keep it safe." Nathan smiled gently. "Does it open something important?" Emily looked down at the worn key before answering. "It used to." Her voice carried no sadness, only quiet acceptance. Nathan realized she was too tired to explain anymore. "You can tell me another day," he said kindly. Emily nodded with visible relief. Before leaving the room, Nathan opened a nearby closet filled with neatly folded blankets. He removed one extra quilt and placed it at the foot of the bed. "If you get cold during the night, there is another blanket." Emily looked around the spacious bedroom once more. "Do you really live here all by yourself?" she asked. Nathan hesitated before answering. "Yes, Emily's eyes wandered toward the hallway lined with closed doors. That must be lonely. The words landed more honestly than any business report or interview ever had. Nathan could not remember the last time someone had described his life so simply. Sometimes, he admitted. Emily smiled with quiet innocence. Maybe houses get lonely too. Nathan softly laughed, surprised by how natural it felt. What makes you think that? She pointed toward the empty hallway. Because every room is waiting for somebody. Nathan stood silently for several seconds after she climbed into bed. The mansion had been praised by architects, admired by magazines, and envied by competitors, yet no visitor had ever looked past its expensive walls. Emily had walked inside for less than an hour and somehow noticed what he himself had ignored for years. After quietly wishing her good night, Nathan closed the bedroom door most of the way, leaving a soft light shining into the hallway. Downstairs, he returned to the kitchen intending to finish the coffee that had gone cold. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the small blue backpack Emily had carried upstairs. Resting on the dining chair beneath the folded note was a family photograph that must have slipped from one of its pockets. Nathan carefully picked it up. The faded picture showed a smiling blonde woman kneeling beside a younger Emily outside a modest apartment building. Both of them held the very same brass key now resting in the little girl's hand. Written neatly across the back in blue ink were the words, "Home is never the building. Home is the person who opens the door." Nathan slowly lowered the photograph, his gaze shifting toward the staircase leading to the quiet bedroom above. For the first time in many years, the silence inside his mansion no longer felt empty. It felt as though it had been waiting. The next morning, sunlight poured gently through the tall windows, washing the mansion in a warm glow that had somehow never seemed noticeable before. Nathan woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or a business meeting, but because he heard something unfamiliar drifting through the quiet house. Soft humming. Curious, he followed the sound downstairs until he reached the kitchen. Emily stood on a small wooden stool beside the sink, carefully watering a tiny potted herb that rested on the windowsill. She looked up immediately when she noticed him. "Good morning," she said with a bright smile. "I found this little plant all by itself. I thought it looked thirsty." Nathan glanced toward the neglected herb. He could not remember the last time he had even noticed it sitting there. "I think you were right," he replied. Emily climbed down from the stool and carefully placed the watering can exactly where she had found it. Before Nathan could suggest breakfast, she quietly began straightening the dining chairs. She folded a napkin that had been left on the table and gently pushed it into place beside a plate. "You do not have to clean," Nathan said kindly. Emily stopped for a moment before answering. "I like helping." Nathan smiled. "Most children like playing first." Emily shrugged softly. "Helping makes me feel like I belong." The words settled into the bright morning air with surprising weight. Nathan looked around the enormous kitchen. It had always been spotless because someone else cleaned it every day. Yet somehow it had never felt cared for until that moment. Together, they prepared breakfast. Nathan scrambled eggs while Emily carefully arranged fresh strawberries onto two small plates. She concentrated on placing every berry neatly in a circle before stepping back to admire her work. "Food looks happier when it is pretty," she explained. Nathan laughed quietly. "I have been eating breakfast for 45 years, and nobody ever told me that." Emily smiled proudly. They carried everything to the long dining table that had been designed to seat 12 people. As always, Nathan automatically placed one plate at the far end where he usually sat alone. Emily paused, then carried her own plate all the way across the room and placed it beside his instead. "Is something wrong with your chair?" Nathan asked with gentle curiosity. Emily shook her head. "Tables are not supposed to be lonely either." He looked at the empty chairs stretching around them before moving his own plate closer to hers. The enormous room immediately felt smaller in the best possible way. After breakfast, Emily wandered through the house while Nathan answered a few business calls. She never touched anything expensive. Instead, she opened curtains to let sunlight inside, straightened a framed landscape painting that hung slightly crooked, and smiled each time another room filled with natural light. Near the family room, she discovered a shelf covered with empty picture frames. Dust had settled across them, suggesting they had not been used in years. She carefully picked one up and carried it to Nathan's study. "Who belongs in these?" she asked softly. Nathan looked at the empty frame for a long moment. Nobody anymore, he answered almost automatically. Emily studied the frame before gently placing it back onto the desk. Maybe they are just waiting. Nathan looked toward the hallway where sunlight now reached places that usually remained dim. For years he had believed silence meant peace. Emily had been inside his home for less than one day, and already she was teaching him the difference between an empty house and a waiting one. As she walked past the front door, she paused, reached into her pocket, and gently held the old brass key in her hand. She smiled at it for just a second before slipping it back into her sweater, unaware that Nathan had quietly witnessed the moment and begun wondering what forgotten door that little key had once been able to open. That afternoon, while Emily colored quietly at the kitchen table with a small box of crayons the housekeeper had found in a storage cabinet, Nathan finally examined the little blue backpack more carefully after asking her permission. Emily nodded without hesitation. "You can look," she said. "There are not many things inside." The backpack felt surprisingly light. Folded clothes occupied one corner, carefully washed and neatly arranged despite their age. A small stuffed rabbit with one missing button rested beside a thin storybook whose pages had been repaired with clear tape. At the very bottom, wrapped inside a clean white handkerchief, Nathan found a small envelope addressed simply, "To the person who opens the door." His hands paused. Emily looked at him quietly from across the table. "Mom said somebody would read it one day," she whispered. Nathan unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, as though afraid the paper itself might break. The handwriting flowed gently across the page. "If you are reading this, it means my daughter has found someone kind enough to let her inside. I cannot thank you in person, but I hope you will understand one thing. Emily has never asked for much. She believes home is wherever people choose each other. Please do not feel sorry for her. She has always carried more hope than I ever could. There is only one thing I ask. Let her keep the old brass key. It no longer opens any door in this world, but it reminds her that once there was a place where she was loved completely. One day she will discover that home is not found with a key. It is found with a heart willing to stay open." Nathan lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak for several moments. He looked toward Emily, who had returned to coloring as though the letter contained no mystery at all. She carefully drew a little yellow house with smoke rising from its chimney. Two people stood beside the front door holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. "Is that your old apartment?" Nathan asked gently. Emily smiled and shook her head. "No." She added another window to the drawing before continuing. "That is the house I hope I find someday." Nathan looked around his enormous kitchen. The polished marble counters, expensive appliances, and elegant furniture suddenly seemed far less important than the picture resting beneath Emily's crayons. "May I ask you something?" he said softly. Emily nodded. "Why do you always carry that key if you know it cannot open anything anymore?" Emily carefully reached into her sweater pocket and placed the worn brass key in the center of the table. Afternoon sunlight reflected softly across its scratched surface. "Because Mom said I should never forget where love began," she answered. "But she also said I should never be afraid when love asks me to walk somewhere new." Nathan gently picked up the key. Years of use had polished its edges smooth, while tiny scratches marked a lifetime of ordinary moments. It was not valuable in the way collectors measured value, yet somehow it felt priceless. Emily quietly watched him before asking the question she had never spoken aloud until now. "Do you think houses can choose people too?" Nathan looked from the little brass key to the drawing of the yellow house, and finally toward the front door, where he had found her only one night before. A slow smile crossed his face. "I think," he answered honestly, "sometimes they have been waiting for exactly the right person all along." Emily smiled with complete satisfaction, carefully took back the old key, and slipped it safely into her pocket once more. Nathan folded her mother's letter and placed it back inside the envelope exactly as he had found it, but something inside him had quietly changed. For the first time since opening the doors of that mansion years earlier, he no longer saw it as a place built to impress the world. He had begun to see it as a place that might finally become someone's home. Over the next several weeks, the rhythm inside Nathan's mansion began changing so gradually that neither of them noticed it at first. Every morning, Emily hurried downstairs before the sun had fully climbed above the maple trees outside, opening curtains throughout the house one room at a time until warm daylight reached every quiet corner. Nathan had spent years relying on automatic lights programmed to brighten each room at precise hours. Yet somehow the house felt more alive when a little girl chose to welcome the morning herself. One Saturday, Emily discovered a recipe book tucked away in a kitchen drawer. Its pages were worn, filled with handwritten notes left by Nathan's late grandmother decades earlier. She carefully carried the book into the family room where Nathan was reading financial reports. "Can we make these cookies?" she asked, pointing toward a recipe decorated with tiny pencil hearts in the margin. Nathan smiled. "I have not baked anything since I was about your age." Emily grinned confidently. "Then today is a good day to remember." Flour dust soon covered the kitchen counters, and the scent of warm vanilla slowly drifted through the mansion. Emily giggled every time a little cloud of flour floated into the air, while Nathan discovered that measuring sugar and stirring cookie dough somehow required far less effort than carrying the invisible weight he had grown accustomed to. When the cookies finally came out of the oven, Emily proudly placed 3 of them onto a small plate instead of eating them herself. Nathan looked at her curiously. "Who are those for?" Emily smiled. "The security guards at the front gate. They stay outside all day." Nathan had greeted those same employees almost every morning for years without ever wondering how often someone thanked them. Together, they walked to the entrance, where the surprised guards accepted the homemade cookies with grateful smiles. During the drive back toward the house, Nathan realized something unexpected. His employees were smiling differently around him now, not because he was their employer, but because kindness had quietly become part of his routine instead of an occasional gesture. Inside the mansion, Emily continued adding small touches that slowly transformed every room. She placed fresh flowers from the garden into simple glass jars, arranged books so they looked inviting instead of decorative, and drew colorful pictures that she taped to the refrigerator with cheerful magnets she found in a drawer. One afternoon, she carefully placed a 3rd coffee mug beside the coffee maker. Nathan noticed it immediately. "Are we expecting someone?" he asked. Emily looked thoughtfully at the empty mug before answering. "Not today." She smiled. "But homes should always be ready to welcome somebody." Nathan looked at the quiet kitchen, remembering how every room had once been arranged for perfection instead of people. That evening, he canceled another unnecessary business dinner and stayed home instead. They ate homemade soup together, played a board game Emily had discovered in a closet, and laughed when neither of them remembered all the rules. Later, while washing dishes side by side, Nathan caught his own reflection in the kitchen window. For the first time in many years, he looked less like a man returning to an empty mansion and more like someone already home. Before going upstairs, Emily stopped beside the front door where she had first been found. She gently touched the old brass key inside her sweater pocket before looking back at Nathan. "My mom always said homes sound different when people are happy." Nathan listened carefully. Instead of hearing only the quiet echo that had filled the house for years, he noticed something new. Soft laughter still lingered in the hallway. The faint aroma of freshly baked cookies remained in the air, and 2 coffee mugs rested beside the sink instead of one. He smiled warmly at Emily. "Your mother was right," he said. "This house does sound different now." Emily nodded with quiet satisfaction before reaching for his hand. Neither of them spoke again as they walked together toward the staircase, because sometimes the strongest feeling of family arrived not through words, but through the peaceful certainty that no one was walking through the house alone anymore. As the seasons slowly shifted, the mansion no longer felt like a place frozen in time. Fresh flowers appeared in the entryway every Monday because Emily insisted that every new week deserved a proper welcome. Nathan found himself leaving work earlier than he ever had before, knowing someone would be waiting to tell him about a drawing she had finished or a bird she had spotted in the garden. Even the employees at Brooks Enterprises quietly noticed the change. Their once reserved chief executive smiled more often, remembered birthdays without reminders, and occasionally carried homemade cookies to the office that Emily proudly packed into small paper boxes. One crisp autumn afternoon, just as Nathan and Emily finished planting colorful mums along the front walkway, a black sedan slowly rolled through the front gate. Nathan frowned, recognizing neither the vehicle nor the woman who stepped out holding a leather portfolio. She introduced herself politely as Rebecca Lawson and explained that she had recently discovered documents identifying her as Emily's distant cousin through her late mother's family. Emily quietly stood beside Nathan, holding the old brass key inside her sweater pocket while listening without interrupting. Rebecca spoke calmly and professionally, explaining that she wished to discuss Emily's future and had already contacted the appropriate child welfare office. Nathan invited her inside, where coffee was served in the same kitchen that had once felt so empty. Throughout the conversation, Rebecca remained courteous, but Nathan sensed something unusual. She knew dates and paperwork with remarkable precision. Yet whenever Emily politely asked simple questions about her mother, Rebecca struggled to answer. She could not remember Emily's favorite bedtime story, the name of the neighborhood park they had visited, or even the color of the blanket Emily said her mother always kept folded at the end of the bed. Emily never challenged her. She simply listened quietly before excusing herself to finish watering the flowers outside. Once she had left the room, Nathan looked thoughtfully toward the portfolio resting on the table. "How long has it been since you last saw Emily?" he asked gently. Rebecca hesitated before admitting it had been several years. Nathan nodded respectfully, appreciating her honesty, yet something inside him grew increasingly uneasy. Later that evening, after Rebecca departed with promises that the legal process would continue through official channels, Nathan found Emily sitting on the front steps where they had first met. The setting sun painted the sky with soft shades of gold and pink, while she rolled the old brass keys slowly between her fingers. Nathan sat beside her without speaking. After a long silence, Emily quietly asked, "If somebody shares your last name, does that always mean they know your heart?" Nathan looked toward the distant hills before answering. "No," he said softly. "Sometimes people are connected by family history. Sometimes they become family because they choose to stay." Emily smiled faintly and rested her head against his shoulder. "I was hoping you would say that." Nathan gently placed his hand over hers, noticing the little brass key resting between their fingers. For the first time since Emily had arrived, a quiet fear settled inside his own heart. It was not fear of legal paperwork or complicated meetings. It was the realization that somewhere along the way he had stopped thinking about offering temporary shelter. Without even noticing, he had begun imagining every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary breakfast they had not yet shared. As the porch light slowly illuminated the front steps where their story had begun, Nathan looked toward the front door that had once welcomed only silence. Now, for the first time in years, he found himself praying that it would never have to close on Emily again. Several weeks later, a quiet meeting was arranged at the local family services office so every adult involved could discuss Emily's future with care and respect. The room was bright, filled with morning sunlight instead of formality, and decorated with children's artwork that reminded everyone why they were there. A social worker welcomed Nathan, Emily, Rebecca, and several case specialists before explaining that the purpose of the meeting was not simply to review documents, but to understand where Emily truly felt safe, supported, and loved. Nathan answered every question honestly. He spoke about school enrollment, medical appointments, bedtime stories, homemade cookies, garden flowers, and ordinary evenings that had quietly become the happiest moments of his life. He never mentioned his wealth unless directly asked. He wanted everyone in the room to understand that Emily had never become important because she arrived at his mansion. She had become important because she had transformed it into a home. Rebecca presented family records showing their distant relationship and explained that she believed she could provide Emily with a stable future. She remained respectful throughout the discussion, but every answer seemed to come from paperwork rather than shared memories. When asked about Emily's favorite activities, she paused before admitting she was still learning them. No one criticized her honesty. Instead, the room grew quieter as everyone realized that belonging could not be measured by documents alone. Finally, the social worker smiled gently at Emily. "You have listened very patiently," she said. "Would you like to tell us how you feel?" Emily nodded and slowly climbed down from her chair. She reached into the pocket of her light blue sweater and carefully removed the old brass key she had carried every single day. For a moment, she simply looked at it, turning it gently beneath the sunlight until its worn edges shimmered softly. Then she walked across the room toward Nathan. Every pair of eyes followed her. She placed the little key into his open hand and quietly closed his fingers around it. Nathan looked at her in surprise. "Emily," he whispered, "this belongs to you." She smiled with peaceful certainty. "It helped me remember my first home," she answered. but I do not need it to find my home anymore." Nathan felt his eyes fill with tears he no longer tried to hide. Emily wrapped her small arms around him exactly as naturally as she had reached for his hand every evening before dinner. Resting her head gently against his shoulder, she whispered, "My mom said one day I would meet someone whose heart would become the safest place I ever lived. I think she was talking about you." Silence filled the room, but it was the warm kind of silence that arrives when every person understands something beautiful without needing more words. Even Rebecca lowered her eyes with a quiet smile, recognizing the bond she had witnessed could never have been created by legal forms alone. After a thoughtful pause, she spoke softly. "I came here believing family was something I could prove. Today I learned it is something people build together." The social worker nodded with quiet understanding before making a few final notes. Looking around the room, she said, "Children deserve stability, kindness, and people who continue opening the door every single day." That is exactly what Emily has found. Nathan gently held the old brass key in one hand while embracing Emily with the other. At that moment, he finally understood the promise hidden inside her mother's letter. The key had never been meant to unlock another house. It had always been waiting for the moment when it would no longer be needed at all. 1 year later, the first light of spring spread gently across the gardens surrounding Nathan's home, where colorful tulips lined the stone pathway leading to the same front door that had quietly changed 2 lives forever. The mansion no longer stood in perfect silence. Children's laughter drifted through open windows. The scent of fresh blueberry muffins filled the kitchen, and cheerful drawings decorated the refrigerator beside family photographs that had once remained hidden inside dusty boxes. Nathan paused near the entrance before opening the front door. Mounted beside it was a simple wooden shadow box protecting the old brass key beneath clear glass. Below it rested a small engraved plaque carrying the words Emily's mother had unknowingly written into both of their futures. "Home is not the place where someone leaves you. Home is the place where someone opens the door." Nathan smiled every morning he passed those words because they reminded him that the greatest investment he had ever made required neither contracts nor signatures. It only required compassion. Emily hurried down the staircase wearing a bright yellow spring dress with her favorite blue ribbon tied neatly in her blonde hair. She carried a small watering can almost as carefully as she had once carried her little backpack. Together they walked into the front garden where a young maple tree had grown steadily over the past year. Nathan handed Emily a small gardening shovel while she laughed at a robin hopping confidently across the grass. They carefully spread fresh soil around the tree before watering its roots together. Emily looked up with a thoughtful smile. "Do you think this tree remembers when it was little?" Nathan gently rested his hand against the trunk. "I think it remembers every person who cared for it while it was growing." Emily nodded happily. "Then it will always remember us." As they stood together beneath the warm morning sun, neighbors passing along the quiet street smiled and waved. Children from nearby homes occasionally stopped by after school to help in the garden, read books in the library, or bake cookies in the kitchen that had once echoed with nothing but silence. Nathan's house had quietly become a place where every visitor felt welcome, just as Emily had once hoped a real home should be. Later that afternoon, they gathered around the dining table, now filled with friends, neighbors, and familiar faces who no longer needed invitations to feel they belonged. The table designed for 12 was finally serving its true purpose. Emily carefully placed one extra plate at the end before noticing Nathan watching her with an amused smile. "Are we expecting someone?" he asked. Emily grinned exactly as she had months before. "Maybe not today," she answered, "but homes should always be ready to welcome somebody." Nathan laughed softly, recognizing the words that had quietly changed his life. Looking around the room, he realized success had once filled his calendar, but love had finally filled his home. Before dinner began, Emily slipped her small hand into his. "Thank you for opening your door," she whispered. Nathan gently squeezed her hand and smiled. With peaceful certainty. "Thank you," he replied, "for showing me that the door I really needed to open was my heart." Outside, the young maple tree swayed gently in the spring breeze, its fresh green leaves dancing beneath a clear blue sky. The old brass key remained safely displayed beside the front entrance, no longer waiting to unlock another house, because its journey had already ended. It had led a little girl to the family she had been searching for and guided a lonely man back to the home he never realized had been waiting inside himself all along.